Hey, so I watched 60 Minutes last night, and I hope you did too, so that you'll understand why I'm as angry as I am, and hopefully you can be angry too. I'm talking about the interview with Jay Powell, Chairman of the Federal Reserve. Now, far too many of you think that the Federal Reserve is part of the federal government. It is not. The Federal Reserve is owned by the banks and protects the banks. You may wonder why in every crisis going back 30 years, the response has always been coordinated by the Federal Reserve. And that is because the Federal Reserve, representing the banks, has co-opted our entire system. The interests of the banks are not our main interest. As long as the Federal Reserve is in control, they represent the banks. They're owned by the banks. They're not federal in any sense, except they have it in the title. So let's think about this issue of what the Federal Reserve is claiming they can do. They claim they can print money digitally. Yes, they can. They can create money. This is part of the problem that those of us who are annoyed and upset and horrified by the Federal Reserve, this is the main problem that we have with the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve can create money and resists being audited. That sounds like an institution ripe for corruption, wouldn't you say? So let me give you another thought experiment. If the Federal Reserve can create money, and that's a good thing for the economy, why can we not create money? Because it's called counterfeiting when we do it, and it's called economic stimulus when the Fed does it. But I will point out to you that counterfeiting is better than economic stimulus. I'll give you two reasons why. The first, if we are counterfeiting, then that money is going to be spent. I believe that if you counterfeit money, you pretty much try to get it spent as fast as possible. That sounds like a really good economic good. When the federal government or the Federal Reserve sends out money, and keep in mind those are two separate groups. When the Federal Reserve sends out money, that money can be saved. There's no telling it's going to be spent. If we counterfeit money, I guarantee it'll be spent. That's definitely a point for counterfeiting. Here's another point. You may not know this, but when the Federal Reserve creates money, they charge interest on that money. If the US government issues bonds and the Federal Reserve buys those bonds, that money is created with interest. It's repaid to the Fed with interest. Now, here's something interesting. This is the Federal Reserve balance sheet. And I'll point out it doesn't even count their response after the internet crash of 2000. And you can see in the darker shaded area the 2008 mini recession and what the response was to that. And if you look to the far right, you can see what the response has been to coronavirus. Now, when the Federal Reserve increased their balance sheet, that means the Federal Reserve is creating money and buying things with it. Specifically bonds, specifically junk bonds now. Junk bonds, things that are less than investment grade. You know, when the Federal Reserve was created, their mandate restricts them to government-issued bonds, period. Only the highest quality. I mean, the Federal Reserve got its nose under the tent by saying that they would only invest in government bonds. In times of great economic distress, they'd be there to take these government bonds off the hands of banks that may not be able to sell them and give them liquidity. They could borrow against it. Now the Federal Reserve is buying trash. I mean, junk bonds are junk bonds. There is an expectation that they're not going to be repaid. That's what junk means. When the Fed started monetizing the debt in 2008, a lot of us spoke out in anger because we claimed that it was monetizing the debt. The US government was issuing debt and the Fed was buying it, and that infuriated us. And the Fed, Bernanke primarily, was very adamant in his testimony to Congress that there was no mandate to buy anything other than the highest credit securities, and that this was not monetization because the federal balance sheet would normalize. In other words, they would sell off all these bonds or the bonds would mature. But if you remember that graph that I just showed you, and I'll remind you by looking at it here, do you see that balance sheet diminishing? No, it's headed to the moon. And whenever there's a new stimulus package proposed by the House or Congress, what do you think is going to happen to the $3 trillion they're going to raise? They're going to sell those bonds. And who's going to buy them? The Fed. And what's the money the Fed's going to use to buy them with? What? The digital creation of money. That's what they're going to use. And if your mouth is not dropping open in horror as you realize what this means for your kids and grandkids, then perhaps you should listen to this again. Please, let's all wake up and pay attention. Look around you. Wake up.